while we wait for another couple of minutes, I can tell you where we are. For those of you who couldn't follow us in the morning, we're covering lecture or topic lecture number 2. In other words, we have left the more methodological, abstract framework issues and topics to start addressing some of the content changed by the digital revolution. I mentioned before, and I'm summarizing in order to wait for latecomers so that they don't miss the next slides, that during this lecture we were going to cover what I called ontology, the nature of reality. We did that from an informational or knowledge-oriented or epistemological perspective. The outcome is what I describe as, but the description has nothing technical in it, is the concept behind the matters, what I describe as a epistemological ontology, which means very simply that our description of the world is the outcome of our perception of the world, that there is no way, or perception in the broad sense of getting the information about, not just seeing or hearing, but also through science, technology, conceptual analysis, and so on. How we grasp the world is a matter of broadly understood information/knowledge, and so is a matter of epistemology. This is a classic move in the history of philosophy, is a epistemology first, metaphysics/ontology after kind of move. There is a way of reconstructing the history of philosophy, and I'm still waiting for more people to join us, so this is a bit of a warming up, that sees ancient philosophy and medieval philosophy as a philosophy fundamentally interested in metaphysics. I disagree. I think that those philosophies were fundamentally interested in ethics and in moderately and broadly understood politics, not life together. What's the good life? What's the right life to have, either individually or as a society? But the reconstruction, which comes from the analytic philosophy tradition, says that essentially ontology metaphysics was at the core of the business. Then we certainly can all agree that no matter what the reconstruction was, ancient, medieval, modernity, starting in philosophy approximately with Descartes, is dominated by epistemology. It's not so much the nature of life, shall we say ethics, politics, or reality, metaphysics, ontology, but it's the nature of our knowledge of life and reality that matters most, that is more foundational. So looking at the foundations of our understanding, philosophers started working on epistemology, Descartes onwards. That's also why skepticism becomes so important, answering the question, can we really know anything for sure? The reconstruction goes on, again from the analytic tradition, saying that the epistemological tradition ends roughly with German classic philosophy between, shall we say, Kant and Hegel. That's the ultimate sort of end of epistemology as the foundation of philosophy, of all other disciplines in philosophy. And the shift was from the nature of reality or the self or the good life to the nature of knowledge about reality, about the self, about the good life, to the language that we use in order to develop knowledge of reality, the self, the good life, etc. So the semantic turn or the linguistic turn, referring to a very famous collected book edited by Rorty, is what characterizes contemporary philosophy. The two contemporary philosophers we normally use as sort of a divide between modern or late modern and contemporary are Wittgenstein and Heidegger. Two German-speaking philosophers, one German, the other Austrian, as you know, who both were crucially interested in semantics. Of course, after Heidegger, etc., we have a whole tradition of semantic-oriented philosophers. The semantic turn in that philosophy, seen from an analytic perspective, looks like what I told you in the previous hours, as an attempt to go back to a pre-Kantian philosophy. In other words, a philosophy that can still talk by looking at language to the ultimate nature of reality. So imagine you move from talking about reality to talking about knowledge about reality to talking about the language that you need in order to formulate your knowledge about reality to talking about language as if it were the expression of being. So the short circuit here is remarkable. I think it's a failure, but it's a very interesting failure. It certainly has led to profound, sometimes confusing, sometimes confused understanding of our life, our ethics, what can or cannot be done. Wittgenstein, on the other hand, belongs to a philosophy of language, philosophy of logic, semantic tradition that does something completely different. It doesn't try to talk about the ultimate nature of reality. You may remember the famous sentence, or whatever you can speak about, you can speak about it clearly. On the rest, you must be, or had to keep quiet, silent. But it is an attempt, nevertheless, to scratch the surface. Now, that initial attempt, Wittgenstein, Russell, looking at the deep structure of language, identifying that deep structure with mathematical logic structure, and then try to develop a mathematical logic-based understanding of the world, leads all the way to contemporary attempts to do philosophy by looking at a variety of different kinds of logics, a variety of different kinds of semantic problems. Again, I think is not longer particularly fruitful. And the attempt there, despite all the warnings from the early Wittgenstein, is once again to grasp the world for what it is in itself. This time, not by looking at language as where being appears or manifests itself, but looking at the deep structures or the profound consequences and implications of some kind of mathematical logic. These days is usually model logic, possible worlds and so on, Kripke, etc., in a way that will tell us something about the thing in itself. Once again, we are bypassing the guardrails provided by Kant, and we end up in difficult territories. The difficulties are, as I told you before, of at least a couple of kinds. One, you have a free-for-all, whatever goes, whatever happens, and it's just a matter of choice sort of philosophy. You can multiply the potential attempts, results, approaches, is anyone's game. Because what we are lacking is a way of having a real confrontation and a real disagreement on the foundational points. This happens in both traditions. I mean, if you look at the late Heideggerian tradition, hermeneutics and so on, insofar as I can say anything, and that so far is very small, it looks increasingly unrelated to anything that happens in the world. Likewise, the analytic tradition is increasingly, as it happens often in the history of philosophy, detached from the foundational issues that are affecting our culture, our everyday philosophy, the world around us. As you may guess, now this is an attempt to make sure that we are on a different path. The different path is to look at the digital revolution and how that has provided new tools and new ways of conceptualizing our philosophical thinking. The final comment before we do some work. This comes from me and not from any analytic tradition, so take it with a huge bag of salt. The history of philosophy can be seen as a wave that goes up and down, up and down. The ups are when great philosophers, I'm afraid mostly male, white, Western in this tradition, but increasingly less so as we move on, and hopefully at some point we will rebalance. It will take millennia, but we're working on it. The long tradition. Great philosophers of all kinds have provided very significant questions and remarkably robust answers to those questions. The reason why we still read Plato and Aristotle is because some of the things that they have said and argued for can still be incredibly relevant to our own life. The downs are when the questioning, the philosophical problems identified by the philosophers become philosophers' problems. Now, this joke happens to be crackable only in English, but the shift from philosophical problems to philosophers' problems is fundamental. Philosophical problems affect everybody. Philosophy problems, no one cares about, apart from people who belong normally to a philosophy department in some university. It becomes a game. So we move from Plato to the Platonist, from Aristotle to Aristotelians, from Heidegger to the Heideggerians, from Wittgenstein to the Wittgensteinians, and so on. Kant and the Kantians, Hegel and the Hegelians, you name it, Descartes and the Cartesians, blah, blah. So up and down, up and down. The stage at which we are these days, hopefully, is just at the end of a down. We still have around us Wittgensteinians and Heideggerians. It is time to go on the uphill again and start readdressing, once again, as always in philosophy, philosophical pressing questions, and do so to generate more ideas, hence conceptual design, as opposed to repeating, rehearsing, revising, talking about, discussing past ideas which have done an enormous amount of good work but need to be updated. I'll tell you more about all this at the end of this lecture, but before, we need to go back to our problem, which was, how does the digital revolution or this new transformation in our culture affect the way in which we conceptualize the world? Let me share the slides and we can start from where we left, which was things and relations. Excellent. You should be seeing what I see.
Yep, we're good.
Thank you. So I won't repeat what we said just this morning, because I hope that the memory is still fresh, or the pain at least, of all those distinctions and blah, blah, blah. But I told you that there is a way of looking at even the physical reality, even from a slightly more scientific friendly perspective. So using less metaphors, remember the roundabout and the roads, to start understanding in what way it is a relation or a process that makes things what they are and the way they are, as opposed to having things first and relations next. Remember, the discussion is chicken and egg, what comes first? Can we have in our model relations first and then things coming out of relations? Relations, as I told you before, but let me repeat, can be either fixed, stable properties. For example, the car is red, redness being a property of the car. Or they can be dynamics. The car is moving from A to B. It's still a property, it's just a dynamic property. For simplicity, and this is an exercise that people in the room who have been trained in some mathematical logic is a trivial exercise. You can transform all properties into relations, and all relations can cover all kinds of properties, including one place properties like is red, as opposed to it is more red than the bike, which is a two places relation. And they can also cover processes, meaning it's moving from A to B. This is all easily formalized. Well, in fact, actually, if we were in the room, I will be using the blackboard behind Emmy just to sketch a couple of symbols to show you how it's done. But believe me, it's trivial. Once we have in our bag of tools two kinds of elements we can play with, either the relata or the relations, here is a way in which we can understand relata as being generated by relations. We use a bit of geometry. Trivial geometry is really not even high school, but I hope it will be helpful. So a long, long time ago, excuse me, someone like me, when I was in school, was told that a geometrical point, think of Euclidean geometry. It's a weird thing, because it's something that has no extension. It's not small, it's not big, it's not large, it's not thick, it's not long, it's not short. It has no extension whatsoever. If you think about it, that's a weird entity to have in your geometry. How do you make sense of it? Well, when I was a kid, that was in terms of a limit of a line. Now look at the line in front of you, and at the two ends, indicated by the yellow, orangey arrows, well, where does the line end? It ends at a point. If I were to ask, okay, well, how big is that point where the line ends? That would be meaningless. Is an unextended element in our geometrical understanding. Now, is this good enough? Yes and no, because we are using two concepts, that of a limit and that of a line. Now, we can revise that because limit in mathematics is complex, to say the least. The difficulty of using it is essentially trying to explain something complex with something even more complex, which is the limit. If you didn't get what a point is, likelihood is that you don't get limit either. So is there a way of doing this differently? Well, we can still use the one line, which is one-dimensional. A line is long. But what we can do these days is actually to use the concept of cut, which is a process. And you have a string, and if you cut that string in two halves, obviously that cut happens at a point. There's a concept of a point. A point is a cut of a one-dimensional line. As often in any reasoning, but especially in philosophy, this leads immediately to the next problem. Well, you need to tell me, I can understand what a cut is. It's a process. It's a process of separating something in at least two parts. So I shouldn't have any problem in understanding what a cut is. But what I don't understand is a line. So, well, in the past, again, limit concept was used and say, look, a line is the limit of a two-dimensional surface. So, okay, that's clear, but can we do without the concept of limit? Can we use the cut? Of course we can. Take a A4, a piece of paper, cut that piece of paper into two halves, and what you have across that line is the cut, which of course has only one dimension. It's long, but it's not thick. I hope this is sufficiently intuitive. It does generate another problem, which is, of course, understanding the 2D surface. Now, so far, nothing in the world has either one or two dimensions. Everything we bump into the world normally, I know that we speak about new particular sort of engineered materials as two dimensions, but that is because they have only the thickness of, say, an atom. Still, they have some thickness. How do we generate a 2D surface using a process? Remember, process first that generates entities. A cut of a line generates a point. A cut of a surface, a 2D surface, generates a line. How do we generate a surface? Well, once again, it was a limit of a 3D object. Now look at the slightly more gray side of that solid. That was over here the limit of that particular solid. This was a surface. But today we can cut through a solid pretty much like you see people cutting cheese in a shop with that sort of metal tool. The line cuts the cheese into two halves once again. And what you have is along the cut, a two-dimensional long and large cut of that 3D object. We're getting to the end because now we need to understand what are 3D objects. And 3D objects, well, we've got a picture here. The point is a zero-dimensional cut of a one-dimensional line. A line is a one-dimensional cut of a two-dimensional surface. A surface is a two-dimensional cut of a 3D object. How can we get a 3D object? Well, a 3D object then becomes a cut in the 4D continuum of space-time. Now, I hope that this is sufficiently intuitive. I certainly find it a little bit less obscure than what I was told a long time ago in terms of space-time is continuum and objects, etc. As you can tell, objects in this particular way of presenting, modeling the physical world out there, works with a continuum and cuts. So the continuum is not an object, and what you get are, or emerge as, objects by cutting through time and space. So you and I, Amy, in front of their computer, we are all just, or if you like, wonderful cuts in a 4D continuum space and time. We appear for a certain amount of time, we will disappear in that continuum back into it. If you need something a little bit more poetic, more metaphorical, imagine a fountain. And Bologna is full of them. There's a beautiful fountain downtown in center. If you are visiting Bologna, now have a look, go there and look at what happens if you can slow time significantly. Suppose we take a video, so we can actually slow down the time and look at the water coming out of that fountain. There are drops all over the place. And every drop is a 3D cut in the continuum of water. That 3D cut will last for X amount of time, comes from the continuum, goes back to the continuum. It exists as an individual just for a little while. And in our case, well, we're getting older as a generation, et cetera, et cetera. So in my case, I hope to get to 100. But that's nothing in the life of the universe. It's a tiny, 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 tiny little glitch. So tiny that, in fact, you might actually not even perceive it. It's a flickering of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a second of anything in the life of the universe. But that little cut, that is the individual, belongs to, is separated from, and then goes back to the continuum that we are discussing. So step back for a moment. I'm not saying that this is the nature of the world around us. I'm saying this is how we can model the world around us to make sense of some things, including, for example, just to give you a physical example for those of you who have been more exposed to science, the dual nature of light. You can ask whether light is a wave or made of particles, and depending on the interface, it behaves like one or the other. From anyone who believes that the world is either discrete or continuous, analog or digital, ultimately, you remember the ultimate question? Oh, Luciano, don't give me all these dollars and euros. What's the ultimate price of the car? Is the world continuous or discrete? Or to put it in contemporary terminology, analog or digital? And the only reasonable answer is, why are you asking that question? And what kind of level of abstraction are you using to answer that question? Depending on the interface, in other words, you will get one answer or the other. And it's not that there is no world out there, but depending on how we interrogate that world, we will get different answers. Now, the question then becomes, do I need one answer rather than another? Why I'm asking it? What is the interest running the purpose behind the questioning? So at this point, we have a way of understanding, and that also relates to some of the questions that we have in this morning. So what difference does it make? Well, at least we have an alternative way of understanding what the world looks like. So this is a representation I found online, and I use it more than once to try to understand what a 4D continuum space looks like. It's dynamic, but no, you make it also fixed. It's quite counterintuitive. So I'm not trying to give you a picture, but this is more what I'm saying. Things are carved out of space-time. If everything around us, the chair I'm sitting on, the computers you can see on the screen, whatever you consider a thing, is just something carved out of space-time, which comes from space-time, will go back to space-time, it's a moment of stability in the endless process of transformation. Well, first of all, you can see on which side I'm sitting when it comes to Heraclitus and Parmenides. Parmenides, I'm afraid I was probably wrong. Being, capital B, never changes, is a super thing, so to speak. In fact, Heraclitus, who reminded us that everything is constant flux, everything is constantly changing. The only real thing in the world is change. Mind again, I'm not saying that one or the other was correct in terms of grasping the ultimate nature of reality, but I'm saying that you can model the ultimate nature of reality one way or the other. And these days, I find Heraclitus' model more convincing than Parmenides. So in terms of the ultimate nature of the world, we can upgrade that sort of sense of thinghood and mechanism and atoms. The book in front of you is by Lucretius. The Rerum Natura is the one that actually described to us. And if you haven't read it, is an amazing book. Please take the time, make the effort of reading it. Is the ancient Greek-Roman synthesis of atomism as it was known at the time, 1st century before Christ, and is remarkably in line with some of the things we still think, certainly with the atomistic, mechanistic view of the world. But remember, we're trying to develop an equally strong, yet different picture of a world that is more of a network rather than a mechanism, and where things happen because relations happen first. Cats generate things, not the other way around. So when you ask about what are things today, a 21st century version of a book about the nature of things, the Rerum Natura, well, this is what comes from a very analytic, very scientifically minded, in fact, rather reductionist philosopher. I don't have a super strong passion or sympathy for Quine. I think, for personal taste, too much of an analytic philosopher to be fully convinced by him. But here is what it tells us about the very notion of an object at all, concrete or abstract, which is a human contribution. I read aloud for those of you who may not find it very intuitive. Science ventures its tentative answers in man-made concepts, perforce couch in man-made language. Oh, those were the days, no, look, still man-made, but that's okay. You wouldn't get away with that these days, rightly so. Anyway, human language and human concepts. The very notion of object or of one and many is indeed as parochial human as the parts of speech. To ask what really is, reality is really like, however, apart from human categories, is self-stultifying, is exactly what I tried to convince you in the last few hours. It's like asking how long the Nile really is, apart from parochial matters of miles or meters. Remember when those guys made the what was that system crash on Mars because they were talking about different kind of metric systems, imperial, etc. The joke I've been cracked too many times by now of asking what's the real price of a car without asking, not telling people what is dollars or euros. There's nothing unrealistic about it. There's nothing unscientific about it. It's a way of doing science more seriously, of being really realist by acknowledging that we get in touch with the system through a model. Any attempt to drop the model means having a stultifying perspective. Now, I'm not sure whether I'm completely following what Quine wanted to say here. I'm afraid there might be a bit more and different in this than I like to read. Remember, Quine is one of the last members of that long tradition, well, decades long, called analytic philosophy. He belonged to a tradition that believed that the ultimate task of philosophy was, shall we say, a philosophical semantics. So clearly for him, language is everything, logic is everything. For us, this is what a metaphor can help us to understand. Things, and I told you before the break, so I'm just going back to that point, things are like roundabouts. It's where relations, functions, processes, etc. meet. They exist, they are deadly serious and very real, but they don't have the primacy that our mammalian brains, and our Western philosophy, Aristotle onwards, have attributed to them by default, unquestionably, uncritically. What we need to shift is to understand, from understanding things as something out there, to be nodes in a network. So what is the criterion for something to exist? Remember, I'll go back to the slides. And when we introduced the two monitors, I told you, look, now by having one or the other, we are actually committing ourselves to different ontologies. An ontology where A and B exist, and an ontology where only B exist. Both ontologies have no idea about C. This epistemological ontology means that, going back to the slides where we were before, that if you ask for, at this point, not your ontological commitment, what your theory and your position commits you to say is out there in the world. Imagine Lucretius saying, in terms of his ontological commitment, there are only atoms. Anything else is made of atoms, is atoms bumping into each other, is sort of trajectories of atoms crossing each other, etc. But the ultimate nature of reality is atoms. Well, that will be your ontological commitment. The counterpart is to ask, what is your criterion? What is your meter? What is your means to establish that something does or does not exist? This criterion, the criterion is the right term here, is a way of asking this particular question in our little example, the super simple example of the two detectors. What is the ontological criterion of existence for level abstraction 1? Movement. If it moves, it exists. If it doesn't move, it stops existing. And if it can never, not even potentially, not even in principle, ever move, it's just beyond my ontology. The criterion of existence for number 2, the level of abstraction that has movement and infrared, is not only movement, but also at the same time the possibility of having emitting, sending infrared to the detector. So these two level abstractions not only have different ontological commitments, but of course the counterpart is that they have different ontological criteria of existence. To exist for LO1 means to move. For LOA2 means to move and being a source of infrared waves. Of course, this is a super simple toy example, but for us, in general, broadly speaking, what does it mean to exist? Well, this is where the digital revolution is already making a big, huge difference. In the past, and for a long time, existence was taken to be a property. Kant is famous for criticizing that. Imagine one were to say, well, the car is red, fast, built in, I don't know, say Germany or United States or Japan or Italy, and it exists. And Kant is famous for criticizing that last step. Existence is not a property. If you had done any philosophy a bit seriously, you know that that is crucial, because depending on whether you accept or deny that existence is a property like any other, you have a different view about, let me put this thing back before you get too confused by that moving stuff. Whether existence is a property or not means that you can or cannot build an ontological argument for the existence of God. So it's not a small step. If you believe that existence is a property, then there's a whole chain of reasoning, not for today, for another lecture, maybe next year, through which you can build a potentially convincing, potentially controversial, plausible, but at least somewhat sort of coherent argument in favor of the existence of God. It's called the ontological argument. The space ontological argument. If you, like Kant, say, look, this is rubbish, there's no property there, well, then the argument is cut at the roots. You cannot even start the argument. Kant very famously said, look, 10 pounds or 10 euros in my bank account, well, the only difference between the ones that I imagine and the ones that are real is that the reals exist. But it would be strange to say that, no, this is an extra sort of quality of those 10 pounds. The 10 pounds have the qualities that they have. For example, I can use them to buy this, worth twice £5, etc., etc. Existence is something more, and it's got something to do with the way we can interact with that object. Well, if this is the case, and mind, the argument is open. I mean, if you think that the ontological argument is rubbish, remember that it was thought to be rubbish by Kant, Russell, and a few more people like that. But he thought other people like Descartes, Hegel, and Gödel thought it was perfectly fine. So anyone who says, oh, you must be silly to think that, no, the ontological argument still has any value, well, remember that one of the greatest logicians of any time thought it was perfectly fine. Far from me to defend it, not here, and I think there is a version of it that makes a little bit more sense, but not for today. It would definitely lead us very distant from anything digital. Back to us. If we need a criterion to determine what it means for something to exist, well, having said what I've said so far, that things are not something that exists in itself of and above the relations that constitute them, the processes that get at that particular crossroad, that is much better to think in terms of things as interactable elements in the reality. So this is the way of reading the last sentence here. To be is to be interactable. If you get this picture and you think, well, I can kind of sympathize with that, consider, therefore, then something that you cannot interact with doesn't exist. So your criterion says, sorry, it's out of scope. Ghosts do not exist because you cannot interact with them. The moment you could interact with a ghost, well, then surely not that ghost would be right there. At the same time, the icon of an app on your mobile phone, that it exists because it responds to your interactions. You can see that we are reordering our ontological picture into things that are even potentially, even in theory, interactable, that can respond to whatever we do with them, to them, and things that are totally, quote unquote, dead, as in you cannot even touch them, you cannot even see them. So interaction in any possible sense. The reason why zombies don't exist and ghosts don't exist and unicorns don't exist is because you cannot interact with them in any reasonable sense of interaction. You can't see them, you can't touch them, you can keep them, you can't even pet them, whatever. However, a lot of digital things that seem to have a dubious sort of ontological status, they're kind of virtual. Think in terms of, and I need to be careful because the expert is on the other side of this call, thinks about virtual reality, metaverse, etc. Well, that is entirely real given our ontological criterion. If I can interact with it, if it responds to my input and vice versa, well, there you go. That is the level of abstraction at which I am modeling that world, and I can respond and vice versa with and to that world. So we are excluding some things and we are including other things. This is not trivial. So once again, warning, please take it with a big pinch of salt. You might end up by having a sort of a collection of entities in your ontology that you may find strange and controversial. Something has changed. Are we still there? Emmy?
Yes, we're good.
Yes.
I'm showing up the window, sorry.
I don't see the screen anymore, but I think we are, you still see the screen as I'm showing it. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Just in case I was just talking to myself and interacting only with myself, that would be a bit embarrassing. So interactions is everything. And going back, summarizing, we have a new way in which we understand the level of abstractions as the way in which we can model reality. The modeling is useful to address endless problems such as logical priority of relata versus relations. It helps us to understand how different models can be compared, different views of the world, essentially, can be compared to each other. Well, it depends on whether they answer the questions for which they were produced more or less successfully. Are they good or bad answers to these particular questions? And we have a clear sense, I hope, of ontological commitment, as well as ontological criterion of existence. All this is deeply influenced also by the digital. I told you that is the digital that is, at least in our culture, I would say, I hope not controversially, making us think all this as less strange, more ordinary than it would otherwise be in the past. We move now to the importance of interaction. To do that, I need your patience. I hope it will be fun, but the concept of interaction and how interaction ends up shaping the world with which we interact is part of our ontology. To do that, I need to introduce a few concepts. They come from film studies. They are super elementary. I hope they will be useful anyway, if you have never encountered them in the past. There will be a couple of videos, so bear with me and hopefully the videos will work. So suppose you are watching, and it will take several slides before we get to the actual relevance of all this to interaction, ontology, the digital. But bear with me, at the end of the trajectory, things should become clear. At the moment, as they say, just enjoy the ride. So, fresh start. Imagine you're watching a movie. If you're watching a movie, there are different ways of describing what's happening in a movie, technically speaking. I mean, if you've done even film studies 101 for beginners. First of all, there is so-called diegetic information. The diegetic information is any information that is shared, accessible within the movie by the characters. I'll give you an example in the next slide. A classic thing is some noise within the movie. A glass is broken. Well, the characters hear the smashing of the glass, as you do. This is internal or diegetic information. Then there is information just for us, the viewers. This is known as non-diegetic information. Now, this should be super elementary. If I insist any more, it will be embarrassing. You may be wondering what is left in this white space. This is the popcorn sort of noise, or the person next to you opening a can of Coke. Is neither part of the characters sort of inside the movie nor outside the movie. Just for us, it's just background noise. But there is also this, we will sort of ignore it. Here's an example of the diegetic, non-diegetic distinction. Diegetic information in a super classic, Casablanca, 1942.
I'll hum it for you.
Okay, if things work well on your side too, and Emmy can confirm, then you heard the noise made, in fact, the music, and she did, both of us. This is entirely internal. It's a way of understanding that the soundtrack is not just for us, it's for everybody in the bar, the famous bar. Now, if you look at the next, fast forward, in the next movie, you have, sorry, in the next sort of short video of the same movie, let me point out where they are. So the airplane in the background is a two engines, old airplane. The noise of that airplane should be deafening. You wouldn't be able to talk to anybody next to the airplane. And listen to the same music that is being played.
It's true. Inside of us, we both know you belong with Victor. You're part of his work, the thing that keeps him going. If that plane leaves the ground and you're not with him, you'll regret it. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon and for the rest of your life.
But what about us?
We'll always have Paris.
Okay, apart from probably the only quote you need to remember from the whole lecture, we will always have Paris, which is so classic that you can always use for almost any opportunity. Whenever they ask you any question, we'll always have Paris. They will never know what you're saying, but it sounds very romantic. Back to us. You must have heard, one, the music in the background. That's just for us. They don't hear it. There's no one there playing their music. It seems to be, even silly to remark it, but mind the airplane too. And that is crucial for the next sort of steps into this diegetic, non-diegetic distinction and interaction. There is no noise about the airplane. Essentially, you are taken away by using information away from the airport within their mental space, the space of this couple, their romantic interactions. The diegetic sort of information is their dialogue. The non-diegetic is the music, which reminds you of the rest of the movie, etc. Now, this is not going to turn into a film studies for beginners kind of up, because I'm not the right person to teach that course, but it's important to have this diegetic, non-diegetic information in place. And here it is. So information is diegetic or not, depending on whether it is available, not accessible, available to the informees within a specified context or environment, their infosphere. Available means just potentially. If anyone had walked into the bar while the guy was playing their music, that character would have heard their music. The music was available to that character, not just merely accessible. So once this is in place and you have the internal external distinction, you can cross the threshold. This is a classic. You tell an artist that there is a distinction, and the next thing that the artist does is to say, okay, I can break that barrier. I can break the barrier between the non-diegetic and the diegetic. I can use the non-diegetic, remember the soundtrack just for us, diegetically, as if it were internal. And I can use the diegetic internal as if it were only external. These are two examples of crossing the boundary. This is the most classic I can think of. Use of non-diegetic, remember, just for us, the soundtrack, internally. Remember, this is a perfect combination with an airplane you did not hear at the airport. So they're talking and you don't hear an airplane that is taking off. This is exactly the opposite. And what's going to happen here will change essentially the way in which you perceive anything afterwards. I still remember in 1979 when I went to see it. Let me spoil it for you for a moment, and then I'll show you the little clip. In theory, that you're going to listen to should be a soundtrack, meaning just for the audience, not for the people involved, not for the characters. The shift, all of a sudden, the realization from us, the people watching the movie, that actually that is not just for us, but is for them as well, means that we are taken into the movie directly. It's like saying, dear viewer, what you thought it was soundtrack is actually, meaning non-diegetic, is actually diegetic information. Therefore, you are on those helicopters. And
to the Romeo Foxtrot, shall we dance?
it goes on But you can tell the pure genius of Coppola. He has used information that until then was classically used just as soundtrack. And in this way, it would be a pop, cheap way of glorifying war. It would be a disaster. It would not be the apocalypse now that we know. But by making it something that the soldiers, have you seen their faces, the Marines are astonished to hear these sounds. And they're as astonished as we are. All of a sudden you realize that this is the crazy guy who actually has this Wagner being played through a sound system by the helicopters, while attacking in disaster. And then the rest of the scenes are horrible violence, etc. But then you are transported inside the events, because what was outside, the non-diegetic, now has been used diegetically. We can skip this until but this is the other way, and this is a super classic. And actually, I use House of Cards, but truly, this is as old as Shakespeare. It's called in theater studies, etc., dealing with the extra wall in the theater. Of course, imagine a theater as the background, left and right, but there is no wall towards the audience. Talking to the audience, interacting with the audience means piercing through, crashing the fourth wall, the wall between us and the performance. Now, of course, even Shakespeare uses that, but of course, and mind, the diegetic, non-diegetic is as old as the Greeks, that distinction. But House of Cards, of course, uses it in a way that is super classic. And if you haven't seen this, well, here is the little clip.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
That I will faithfully execute the office of
Power is a lot like real estate. It's all about location, location, location. The closer you are to the source, the higher your property value. Centuries from now, when people watch this footage, who will they see smiling just at the edge of the frame?
So congratulations.
That is as good as the Apocalypse Now that I showed you before. It is, of course, well, I don't want to spoil it for you. Well, someone who will have a big role in the future, if you haven't seen the series, waving to us, talking to us, and that happens again and again during the series. Now, it's a super classic, and if done properly, it really breaks that diegetic only, no, internally only, kind of context in a non-diegetical way. At this point, we are also brought into the game. So you can break the barrier, sorry. And at this point, we have the internal, diegetic, the external, non-diegetic, and we can introduce the concept of trans-diegetic. When you go from diegetic to non-diegetic and vice versa, you move through. Now, in this case, the interactive nature comes as a fundamental difference. Interaction erases the distinction between the internal and the external information. It enables you, as imagine the audience or the viewer, to interact with the characters inside and vice versa. So information becomes trans-diegetic, a word that I have kind of hijacked from other contexts, if it can move seamlessly between the diegetic and the non-diegetic spaces dynamically. The whole difference here is made by the user interface. Does the user interface enable me to interact with information inside and outside the space of observation that I'm looking at? Let's step back before I show you a couple of classics ways of doing this design in video games. One, we model the world. We model the world at a certain level of abstraction. We choose the level according to a purpose. Different purposes justify different level of abstractions, justify different models. All that leads to the possibility of modeling the world, not just in terms of mechanism, atoms, and modules, etc., bottom up, but also in terms of network and relations before and later, processes before what is being processed. The processes lead to things, the cut generates the objects, not the other way around. One of the advantages of all this is to have a clear ontological commitment. What am I committing myself to? Well, I have to choose the purpose and the level of abstraction, so it becomes clear that I'm committing myself to that view of the world rather than another, and also therefore to comparative potential critical assessment of my choices. Excellent. It also leads to the possibility of bypassing logical order problems, chicken and egg kind of problem. It enables, finally, to have a more contemporary sense of what is an ontological criterion of existence: interaction. If it is interactable, it exists, and it exists if it is interactable. So anything that is not interactable in any possible way and sense, goodbye, and anything that is potentially interactable one way or another, well, it comes as within our modeling of the system. Interaction, therefore, is the key. What kind of interaction? Well, there is a way of making sure that this interaction is not just a matter of changing the world, but also changing the world in a way that responds to us, and we cross the boundary between what we are observing and what we are changing in what we are observing. It's a bit like cooking. You're not just looking at the ingredients, you change the ingredients, and as you cook, you probably modify, you taste too much salt, too little salt, etc. So interaction is everything, and we need to have a sense of what it means to have internal and external information, the exchange between the internal and the external. I introduced therefore the diegetic, non-diegetic. After that distinction, I introduced this sense in which you can use diegetic internal information in a non-diegetic way, and the non-diegetic external information in a way that is internal, diegetically. Fine. If we add interaction, that transfer is not just Apocalypse Now or the Netflix series, which is fixed. You can't do anything. That was just an illustration of how you move from inside to outside, but you can't make a difference yourself. But you can add, actually, finally, the interactivity that erases the distinction between diegetic and non-diegetic. Once you do that, you get trans-diegetic information, which can move seamlessly between the diegetic and non-diegetic dynamically. Of course, to do that, you need to have a user interface. Now, the best user interface we have is provided by nature, is our body. But short of that, we also have a lot of user interfaces that are in front of us. To illustrate this, the best way of doing it, to my sort of knowledge, is by relying on games. Games have all the properties that I introduced before: diegetic, non-diegetic, and diegetic use non-diegetically, and the non-diegetic use diegetically. It's going to be difficult, and but on top of that, they also have the ability to enable us to interact with all that dialectic. So these are a couple of classic examples. I'm not an expert on games, so if anyone has better examples, please provide them. This is a quick summary. See, information internal, external, and how you cross the boundary between the two. Now you can do that not only in a movie or in theater, but you can do that in terms of us being the interacting agents who trans-diegetically transform internal and external information. In other words, our modeling changes the model, and the modeled changes our modeling according to our own way of interacting with the system. So this is from diegetic to non-diegetic, a classic design. Mass Effect 3 is quite old because that's the way, at least when I grew up, single shooter things look like. If you look carefully, and I'll show you the video in a moment, but already here, you can see here weapon and some numbers, quantities, assessment of the state of play, which are just for you. These bits of information are not shared with anyone within the game, as it were. Now, the characters cannot see them, so to speak. These are not the music played in the bar of Casablanca. These are the sort of music played at the airport. So all this is non-diegetic information that in the design of the weapon we assume is needed by the player in order to interact with the world. And as the player interacts with the world, those data change. So there is the non-diegetic here, there's diegetic information inside, but above all, there's the transdiegetic, which is generated by my interaction with the game that changes the information that I can see. A much more trivial example, but it takes much longer, is me and my scale while I am on a diet. I can see the numbers, I can see I'm too heavy, I need to have more diet. As I diet, I can see different numbers. So the information provided by, at that point, I'm a player within the game is called dieting. The information that is entirely diegetic is being affected by my interaction with my food and the way I eat. This is the same age, roughly speaking, but that's space 3. And now again, I wanted to choose another third-person shooter's kind of perspective, so we don't have too much difference. But here, look at what happens in the design of the game. You see these cars here? Here, over here, and here. These are information about the game, which are inside the game. And we stop here because this is the bit that makes all the difference.
Sorry, Michelle, can you repeat what you were saying at the beginning of the video? The sound was covering your audio.
Sorry. We covered this and you heard it. Yep. Emmy, I can't hear you.
Oops, yes, just what you were saying when the most recent video was playing.
Okay. So, in fact, actually, let's see if I can do the mute version. And you can still hear me, right?
Yep.
You should not hear anything from the video, hopefully, and just see it. This bits of information on the back of the player, of the character, and at the end of it, the bits of information that you find on the back of the character over in a moment. 1, 2, 3, and stop here. Yep. You see this design here? This is information about, I can't remember whether ammunition, life expectancy, whatever the information is, which I've forgotten, it doesn't matter. But this information has 2 features. One is for us, but it's also for the other character. This character can see this. This is like the music in the bar in Casablanca. Not only we can hear it, but it's also, so it's non-diegetic, but it's also diegetic. The fundamental difference with anything, as I told you before, the transdiegetic, which is quite fixed in a sort of in a movie, is that this is not fixed. It depends on our interactions with that character, and therefore this character will see different information as we externally interact with it. That's the transdiegetic movement of and above, moving inside and outside in a way that breaks the skin. So if you go back to Apocalypse Now and House of Cards, those are 2 ways of doing the inside-outside game, but they are totally fixed. We can't do anything about it. We can watch it again. We can enjoy it many times, but we have no way of controlling what happens to that piece of information. But the world is not like a movie. The world is much more like a game, a computer game, a place where you're not simply watching what happens, but your actions affects the information in what you are watching. So this is a much more sort of realistic way of representing the transdiegetic nature of our interactions. The following examples should be even more intuitive. Let's see if I can show them to you. Yeah. So why does this matter? Because the digital revolution is transdiegetizing our world. And that's a long way of saying, different word to say something that I think is quite trivial by now, having spent hours working on this. I'll do this once again. We don't grasp the world for what it is in itself. We model the world. We model the world at a level of abstraction, which we choose in terms of a purpose. Underground, mapping, etc. By doing that, we commit to saying that the world is in a way or another. For example, a particular map as opposed to another map of the underground. It's not a final commitment. We can have many commitments. We can be, if you like, unfaithful to our commitment. We don't have to marry only one map of the underground, but any map of the underground that we marry is a commitment to that particular model of the system. We gain a lot by doing this. We avoid all the problems of all the metaphysics from Hegel through Husserl to Heidegger, the three H, remember, H, which are all attempts to talk about the world in itself, either through language or through some kind of special way of suspending judgment, etc., the epoche in Husserl, etc. We avoid that, and we gain in clarity of ontological commitment, but also ease in terms of modeling. We can model in terms of logical preference. Chicken and egg is up to us at this point, and we can shift from a things-oriented to a relation-oriented perspective. This is valuable for a reason that I try to explain, but more on this also in the following lectures. But once we move from relations first, there's a lot to be said, remember Descartes, etc. But relations first is also a matter of how we create, change, modify these relations. Interactions is fundamental. Interactability becomes our criterion of existence, our ontological criterion. Something exists if it is interactable. If it is interactable, it exists. Otherwise, nothing. But what is interaction? We show this in terms of diegetic, non-diegetic, transdiegetic. Why the dynamic interactive nature of the transdiegetic is so important? Well, because of that sentence, and we're finally here. ICTs, information and communication technology, or the digital revolutions are making our world increasingly transdiegetic, meaning that we, as if we were the audience of this theater, are increasingly involved through our potential minimal, sometimes limited interactions to change the world and vice versa. To understand this, I have another couple of tiny videos here. One is, they're all old, so you can get kind of classic. This is to show you what it means to transdiegetizing the world. This is just a game, and it's a very old one. You can tell that there's a lot of diegetic and non-diegetic information. And of course, all the non-diegetic information, the information that is just for us externally, is modified by our way of playing. So you get this by now. Now, that looks remarkably similar to something that happens in the real world. This is the real world. And again, it's an old app, Harris lap timer. A lot of non-diegetic information just for us, which is modified by our driving inside here. So another way of putting this is that whenever we take, say, a car from here to there, and we are following Google Maps, well, this is totally transdiegetic. We are both inside and outside the quote-unquote game of moving from A to B. The information we receive is also information that is modified by our interactions with the world, for example, in terms of less kilometers to go through from A to B, and so forth. As we move forward in our life, the more the digital technologies are surrounding us, the more it looks like this. So if you probably couldn't avoid hearing, seeing, talking about the Apple launch of their own not to be called metaverse, virtual reality, etc. That is more transdiegetic stuff happening there. So this diegetization of ICT displays, meaning the information that we put out there within the game, is happening increasingly around us. I don't think it will end up being boundless. I think at some point, and we might have reached the point in some context or not, depending on the technology in the future. The future is open. At some point, probably we will reach some kind of saturation, some equilibrium. But there's much more of that than ever before in human history. So when I ask that question from mass affecting to dead spacing, it really means, are we going to see a world in which information is something that is put on top of the world? So you have augmented reality. That is very much one way of designing it. So you have a lot of non-diegetic information just for you. Imagine you on your sort of, once upon a time, not Google Glass, but it could be anything else. Or are we going to see as well, or even more, the game is open, something like dead spacing, so that information is inside the world. So it's you moving into a world where there's much more sort of virtual reality, and it is the movement from outside to inside that happens to you, as opposed to the reality getting labels. You are inside a place which is labeled. Depending on whether you look at the, these are all pictures, by the way, as usual, top left or bottom right, you get one or another of these designs. Either way, we are looking at a world in which the interaction with information changes the information, and therefore this diegetic, non-diegetic gets more transdiegetic, and it gets so interactively. That leads us to a primacy of relations. We look at the world increasingly in terms of a network and less in terms of a mechanism. Looking at the world as a network made of relations, interactable. I gave you some kind of points to reflect more about the interactability, diegetic, non-diegetic, transdiegetic interactability, etc. Well, it means having a sense of the world that is more like this, objects as nodes. And the network in question becomes our background philosophy, the philosophy we don't even justify, we don't question. A word about this before closing on this particular point and moving to a slightly different one. There's one more, no, two more slides. When I speak about our philosophy, what I mean is that at some point in our philosophical thinking, in any culture, at any time, in any corner of the world, what we call philosophical thinking becomes sedimented into assumptions we don't question anymore. Now, it may be that those assumptions we don't even question are already there, and the philosophical thinkings enables us to bring them to the surface. That's normally one of the tasks that people attribute to philosophy, becoming critically aware of what your assumptions are, and sometimes, therefore, the ability to drop them. Typical exercise in the meditations in Descartes is going through a number of procedures or ways of thinking to make sure that he's become fully aware of what he assumes and can drop what is not really tenable, can maintain or justify what needs to be reintroduced as critically acquired knowledge. But more often than not, rather than being philosophy bringing up to the surface the assumptions that are our cultural bedrock, to speak more in Wittgensteinian terms, is the other way around. Philosophy starts sedimenting slowly into assumptions that we don't even more question anymore. Typical way of thinking normally here is all the vocabulary that we use in political thinking. Democracy is something that we don't really question anymore. We take it for granted that it's something that we enjoy, that we want, that we would like to spread, etc. It takes a philosopher to reconceptualize that, to re-problematize it, and make it something that comes to the surface again of a critical discourse. Normally, it sinks back into like, okay, of course we know, we understand, who doesn't like philosophy, etc. Now, back to us. The mechanical, atomistic way of looking at the world is very mammalian, as I said, very natural to our biological organisms, and has been sort of supported, promoted implicitly most of the times by most of Western philosophy as a default position, or something like you start from, but you don't question. I try to unhinge that particular assumption in the 2 or 3 hours we spent together, more in the following. You don't have to share my view, you don't even have to agree with me, but as long as that sense of there are other ways of thinking about this starts sort of clicking in, then job done. We don't need to understand the world in terms of objects first as nodes. We need to understand the world as relations first, and objects as something that emerges from, is a byproduct of the relations, the processes, the links, rather than the linked. Having this network as our philosophy enables us to see other things and classic things differently. This is a way of putting it in Wittgensteinian terms. It's the beginning of the Tractatus. It's translated into contemporary terms. Wittgenstein speaks of facts, but we can translate that into a totality of relations. The totality of the world is the totality of relations. Remove the relations and there is no actual world. There is nothing there. For the future, I haven't done that, I haven't worked on that paper, but what you look at is often subject to what is called in mathematical context graph theory. Now, normally graph theory doesn't have a privileged position when it comes to nodes and arches, the link between the nodes. But there is a special sub area of graph theory that assumes as one of the axioms that there is no such thing as a single node independent of the network. If you start therefore from the idea that any network is a connected network, meaning that look at this particular network, for example, it has these white dots that are unconnected. To have them, logically speaking, you would have to assume an Aristotelian, Lucretius-like, atom-first, mechanistic view of the world. If you have a network in which these nodes don't exist, but is more like this, for example, all the nodes are one way or another more or less connected, then you can start developing a network first, top-down, holistic view of reality. Remember, what we're doing is still modeling. We're not talking about the real world in itself, but how best to model it, depending on the questions we want to ask. This is the summary of that. The totality of the world happens to be, looks like as the totality of the relations. If you have networks like the right-hand side, you can also have a mathematical modeling of that is quite robust. Meaning that, and I told you that I was coming back to the chicken and egg, in this modeling design, we can decide what comes first, relator or relations. This is the major, probably the most difficult objection to any ontology which privileges relations over relator, so links over nodes. How can I have links without having something that is linked? Remember what I said in terms of the love between Romeo and Juliet? Well, I mean, you may be as poetic as you like, but no, for that love to be there, you have to have the two people here, the two teenagers. Not if you're modeling that. Yes, if you pretend to talk about a system, but not if you're modeling it. In a model, you can simply decide to start from the egg and go towards the chicken. What's the difference here is the difference that you have, for example, when you model a logical space versus a physical space. This is also very intuitive, I hope. So one more thing to have in your bag of tools. Imagine any board game, especially chess, but checkers would also work and similar. In chess, you have some rules that tell you how to move the pieces. You don't have to be a chess player to know anything about this. But you can imagine that depending on the rules, it takes more space, quote unquote, more steps to move from one place to another. For example, the queen can move quickly through a number of squares on the chessboard. So the distance between, say, the queen and the pawn varies depending on whether it's the pawn moving towards the queen one step at a time, or the queen in a single gigantic step moving towards the pawn. It makes no sense to ask for the distance between the pawn and the queen without asking who is moving, because it's only one move in one case, and it could be 4 in the other. Imagine a diagonal. If you have a triangle, the diagonal of the triangle is, it takes a different amount of space to take from one corner to the next. But if you move like the king, 1 square at a time in diagonal, this is the same number of steps that it would take, because, of course, it's a logical space. So a logical space is determined by the relations that are constitutive of that space. Physical space has other rules that we need to model differently. The same happens with the logical and chronological order. The logical order is something that is determined by the rules we put in place. So if we decide to model the chicken and egg starting from the egg, that's as good as any other. It needs to be justified, though. Remember, by what questions, the level of abstraction, the purpose, and so on. But there is no sense in asking intrinsically in a model what comes first, whatever you choose. So there's one more way of describing the commitment. You are really making a step into, it is my responsibility of, in a very Cartesian sense, it is up to me to model the world in a way rather than another, and I will pay the consequences if that model is wrong. I mean, there's a famous phrase, I don't know who, I think it was unfortunately Anne Rand that put it forward, so not a really real philosopher, but which says, no, you can ignore reality, but not its consequences. Mind. So back to us. Modeling and design, they give us the responsibility, the power, the freedom, and therefore something carefully and dangerously handled to model the world the way we think is preferable, fittest, so to speak. At this point, we have a bit of time for Q&A. Because we can start a whole new area, a new section of the lecture, I'd rather stop here, because the jump will be otherwise too wide, and maybe close with some Q&A if there are any, and if people are not already totally exhausted. So I stop the sharing, and we will start tomorrow morning, again, entirely online. I apologize for anyone who came to Bologna on purpose. I'm terribly sorry. My passport is still with the American consulate. Don't worry, no trouble, no legal trouble, just slow bureaucracy. And I hope to be with you from Saturday onwards. But the lecture tomorrow and on Wednesday will be entirely online. And now you should see me as opposed to the slides. And I wonder whether there are any questions, or people are so exhausted that they can't wait to say goodbye.
We did have one come through on the chat from Celebrate Mind. Well, I'll do this and then Paul and Raphael. So we've got, how is this not a solipsistic view of reality through the lens of real systems? And does it not diminish the possibilities present in deeper understandings of what is or accurately reflects reality?
Where I can find
it's a few messages up in the chat from Celebrate Mind.
Let me just find it. Okay. Yeah. Yes. Well, solipsism, you can read solipsism. I'm the only one here. Basically, anything else is a projection of something on myself and so on. In two different ways. One is individual solipsism, and the other one is human solipsism, as in humanity as a single agent. I think that the point raised here is applies to the human as single agent. And it has happened to us as humanity for a long, long time. Being the kind of species we are, with the kind of organs and body and abilities scientifically, technologically that we have, we might still be unable to go beyond our solipsistic, i.e. so human solipsistic construction of the world around us. It has taken a long, long time to understand, for example, that whales and dolphins are communicating. It's remarkable what we might actually discover in the future in terms of how other species are able to interact within themselves. Now, this is just trivial biology. Some of you will have bump into the little dance that the bees do in terms of communicating, how far some interesting source of food is or not. But humans, for example, all biological communication has come much later in our understanding because we are, to begin with, by default, embedded within a particular view. What makes the huge difference, and it's a fundamental difference between us and any other species, any other animal, is that we can transcend that. We are able to overcome that particular embedding and, for example, imagine what it would be like not to hear or to do something else. Or we can develop tools, for example, to see like snakes, to hear like dogs, to explore much more than that little spectrum of visible light and so on. So I would say that solipsism is a default position for humanity that can be overcome. It's not an individual problem, because the individual is embedded in a community of speakers who can communicate at the same level. So whereas I do not, and I cannot speak to a snake or a dog and ask, what does it feel like to hear or see those kind of bits of the world, I can certainly talk to Emmy and Claudio and say, well, no, from your perspective, etc. This is the beauty of dialogue, of open-mindedness, the ability to change our minds and so on. So the enrichment that we can get by talking to each other is extraordinary. And yet that doesn't really resolve completely the human solipsism problem. But that is a different kind of sphere of this difficulty. Shall I just go through the other questions here in the chat? Yeah,
well, there's sort of a dialogue going.
Okay.
But yeah, people would love to hear your thoughts on what they were talking about.
Right. Yeah, there's which is fine, and it's great to have that dialogue internal, or exactly what I promoted a moment ago. Now let's see if there are any questions. Oral.
Raphael.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Once again, the way. Okay, thank you for this lesson. It becomes a clear some concepts about it. My question is like, as we start to understand and interact the world as relations, doesn't it goes back to the level of abstraction? For example, when we deal with a game, we as a gamer and as a player, what are the boundaries when we need to understand and understand the limits of the reality we are interacting with? Because if you need to understand all the networks involved, so we need to go to the producers of the game, the marketeers, all the politics, all the subculture inside the game. It would become like an infinite network of relations. When does it? Where are the limits? So the limits are set by our levels of abstraction and model and design. That would be the way to understand it. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a very good question, and it is a real problem. We will see this actually is one of the issues that we will discuss in depth when talking about complexity. But the point that you are making can be translated into complexity jargon by saying how many nodes in the network are required to solve a particular problem. And if you end up by saying all of them, then you know that you have the maximum degree of complexity of the problem in question. So another way of putting your question would be, what kind of problems are so complex that they require every node in the network to be solved? Now, luckily, in life, a lot of problems we have do not require all the nodes in the network. If I need to do some shopping today, I might need to interact with Kia, with my wife, and go together and so on. But it's a two nodes kind of problem. But of course, if we need to organize, as we did some time ago, a party for lots of friends and colleagues and students and so on, well, it might be a many nodes problem. We need to coordinate many more nodes. The kind of point that you were making is that there are issues, though, that require many nodes, and sometimes perhaps all the nodes in the network. Now, climate change, for example, is one of them, and that is a disaster. It cannot be solved by just a few nodes, not even big nodes, not even very large nodes, unless you get the whole network ready to interact, or shall we say, marginal bits of the network can be considered negligible, but the bulk of it moving in that direction, you don't solve it. Now, with this in mind, the kind of example that you were providing is a kind of middle ground between me going shopping and global climate change. Take the ethics of AI. The recent appeals, they all point in the same direction. You need to have what we normally call all the stakeholders to have a debate. Now, which ones are the stakeholders? Well, the users, of course, the producers, of course, the lawmakers, of course, and who else is there? Well, for example, and this is an interesting point, anyone defending the environment, which is also a stakeholder there, but is not represented by anybody. It's not me not being affected, say, by a piece of AI. It's not the bank using the AI. It's not the producer of the AI, and it's not even the lawmaker, not regulating the producer, the user, etc. So who is representing the environment here? So you might have some NGO representing the environment in terms of impact and so on. At that point, you start enlarging the sense of which nodes need to be in place. In this case, we call them stakeholders to make a difference. But back to your question, deciding how wide the network needs to be for the problem to become solvable, that is not policy 101. Essentially, who is going to be invited at the table? So imagine something completely different, the war in Ukraine. Who needs to be at the table? How many nodes of their network need to be there? Ukraine, of course, Russia, of course, but do we need Turkey? Do we need Syria, who is selling all the stuff to Russia these days? Do we need the EU? Do we need the US? Is China going to be involved? But let's say, for example, a completely different South Africa. Probably not. Not that I have anything against South Africa, but it seems to be a node in a network really distant from the relevant networks that can make a difference to the war in Ukraine. The Baltic countries, independently of whether they want to be represented by the EU or not. That sounds like a good idea, maybe. India, it's open to debate. Maybe it could make a big difference. And if India and China were to get together and say, dear Russia, enough is enough. We're not going to buy anything from you. And unless you change course, this is it. Well, surely there could be two heavy nodes, etc., etc. But Brazil, well, who knows? The Vatican, another mysterious node, which, and it's all realistic. I mean, the Vatican has started promoting some kind of a neutral platform for peace. So you can tell that even deciding which nodes are going to make a difference is part of the design. But that doesn't mean that therefore we're wrong. It means that we need to double the efforts in understanding which bits of the network are going to make a difference today and tomorrow. So no, thank you for the question, but we will come back to this when we discuss complexity. And if I don't remember this, please remind me.
Thank you, Professor.
We have another question coming in through the chat, well, the two-parter. So first part, in interaction between humans, how does perception influence interaction? And the second part, how is technology affecting perception, and how is it influencing interaction?
Probably not for a philosopher who can only give a shallow conceptual answer to this question. So let me tell you something that I've learned from my wife, who is the real person to ask this question to. She's the chair of neuroscience here in Oxford, and I can tell you that perception and interaction are hugely linked. Something that neuroscientists, especially after my wife's studies, called as pre-memory, or anything that prepares you to perceive things in a certain way, is fundamental. In fact, the whole world of attention, which is a technical word mislabeled by neuroscientists to talk about how you perceive the world, they call it attention because it's a very focused perception, like the perception I have at the moment of the screen in front of me, as opposed to what's happening behind me with the books. So this whole world of attention is hugely shaped by past experience, future expectations, and therefore ability to interact with the world or not. Now, this is the end of the philosophical shallow answer. For anything more, we can ask the lady in the other room. But be reassured that it's immense. To the extent that sometimes you really wonder what the world would be like if we were built in a radically different way. And for those of you who have not done it before, I recommend to go on YouTube and run the so-called gorilla experiment. I cannot tell you, because if I tell you, you will miss the special effect, but trust me, is astounding. And if I remember, I'll show it to you next time if we have extra time. Don't forget, YouTube gorilla experiment is the answer to that question.
Seconding the gorilla experiment. It's a great video. We got another question from the chat. So in regards to the last slide, I was wondering if there are any ways to tackle the problems of systems with emergent properties, those being properties that are not to be found in any of the components of the system but emerge from the interactions. Is it possible that a property like that could disrupt the entire process of understanding how the specific relations between the nodes of a network work?
So I think that this contains two different questions. How to perceive, how to handle, model emerging property, and can they disrupt the system? One is epistemological, and the answer is, unfortunately, it depends a lot, but normally yes. If we are good enough, and we need to be good enough, to perceive features that we have not anticipated, then we should be able, if the model is good enough, to capture those emerging properties. I'm trying to offer a simplified example with what we had during the lecture in terms of the two monitoring systems. I can't think of anything that is as simple as that. Imagine that you have the monitor system in terms of just movement, and all of a sudden that movement starts looking as amazingly well structured. So the movement is not just a random movement of a branch of a cat walking, but is, for example, by just tracing their movement, is that designing letters, shaping letters on the grass of your garden. Is an A, is it a B, or is it an H, and then is an E, and an L, and a P, and is help. And so the cat is walking the garden, and by walking the garden is shaping help. So that would be totally spooky. And of course, it would be an emergent property of system you didn't imagine it. But the system would allow that. I mean, epistemologically, you could have that kind of openness. One thing that science is constantly trying to do all the time is to have that openness, to make sure that you don't close your scientific investigation, your understanding and perception to signals that you had not predicted to begin with. This is the opposite of having this openness, or having too little data or signals to shape a particular understanding. So dogmatism, in other words, is the opposite of what that question is pointing towards, the closeness to anything that doesn't fit within the framework I have identified. Identifying a framework, let me remind you, adopting a level of abstraction doesn't mean that I do not have the chance of adopting others. Remember when I gave you the example of the three people talking about a car, a motorbike, or an airplane? Well, you could, as a single individual, adopt all three of those level abstractions, and therefore being open to extra elements and data and emerging properties that are not yet predicted. That's the epistemological side of the question. The ontological one, can sort of emerging properties disrupt the system? Well, unfortunately they can, because a lot of these systems have feedback loops. So something that emerges as a property, as it grows, can generate more interaction that go back into the system itself and modify the causes of those emerging properties. We tend to think, and I am a sinner, I mean, the way I presented in these lectures is the oversimplified view that a system is a closed system, but nothing in life is a closed system. I mean, not even the most sort of extraordinary case. We have systems whose relations to other systems are negligible, but that's another story. The butterfly always has an effect on anything else, not just now the storm on the other side of the universe. It's just that those effects are negligible. They're so small and counterbalanced by other things, etc., that we just sort of easily ignore. To take one of those pictures where there were all the nodes and all the links, what we do normally in order to understand something is that we cut off all the links that seem to be too weak, irrelevant, marginal, and we concentrate on the bulk of the nodes and the links. But it doesn't mean that those links were not there. Remember, there is no node independent, alone, single, cut off from the rest of the network. So the fact that emergent properties might actually disrupt the system, it goes with the logic of the system itself. We're almost there. Maybe we take one more question.
Yes, okay. Would it be correct to claim that we can use set theory to model the knowledge of the world?
This is a good question because it's the wrong perspective. I didn't want to go down this road, but set theory is exactly what we've been using to do exactly the sort of thing that we should avoid. Set theory starts from elements, members of a set. And if you've done any logic at all, even the most beginner set theory or anything, one course on predicate logic, you know that what you start with is A and B and C, or X, Y, and Z. You quantify on those elements. You say, for example, A for every A and B and C, or for every X, and you build from there. So the logical predicates presuppose elements. In other words, is an actor first, network later, is an object first, properties or processes later, is a sort of substance first, function later. It's exactly what we should be abandoning if we can do that. That's why I recommended the other tool, graph theory, with the assumption that there are no independent nodes. Let me remind you, however, a couple of things, and then we close here. It's a great tool, and that's what we use by default in any mathematical analysis. From Whitehead and Russell onwards, Principia Mathematica onwards, we reduce all the maths to arithmetic to mathematical logic, mathematical logic to roughly set theory with a bit of extra. Set theory requires some assumptions. Zamero-Frankel, for those people who have done this stuff, it's called naive, has got nothing naive about it, but naive set theory and so on. Some of the axioms just have to be accepted. You cannot justify them. No, there are reasons why you cannot. Having said that, the whole construction is object-oriented. I'm sorry for the computer scientists in the room. It's got something to do with that. In fact, object-oriented is exactly the opposite of what object-oriented means. But as you, in object-oriented, you can encapsulate processes and values into an object. In set theory, you start from entities and you move from there. You Quine himself, for example, would have told you that to be is to be the value of an existentially quantified variable. It's a bit of a mouthful, but essentially it tells you first there is a variable, there's a quantification on that variable that says there is an x such that that x is a car. As you can tell in that sentence, which is exactly what Quine is saying, there is an x such that x is a car. What comes first is the object, the x that is quantified as there is one and that one is. So set theory, great spot, no, well, great intuition, however, wrong direction. We need to move in the opposite direction. Now, for those of you who have done some category theory or other things like that, it doesn't work. It's so hard to model mathematically things without talking about objects. Having said that, essentially mathematics has abandoned an entity or a substance perspective almost 100 years ago. And if you want to know anything more about this, the essay by Cassirer, From Substance to Function, is exactly what you need to read. It's a masterpiece of philosophical thinking from a great philosopher, and it shows you how mathematical thinking, philosophically speaking, has moved from the idea, for example, that numbers were things, to the idea that numbers are the outcome of some operations of a certain kind. To give you a final example, and we close there, otherwise this becomes a philosophy of maths kind of class. If you start from integers, you get negative numbers because you have an operation which is subtraction, and subtraction between two numbers when the first is smaller than the next, so 5 minus 7 is not covered by integers. As we say, subtraction is, so the set of integers is not closed under subtraction. In order to have that closure, to have, in other words, a set that by applying the operation, you stay in that set, you need to enlarge the set. You need to go into negative numbers, and so on. The more operations you have, the more kinds of numbers you need. Cut and objects is the same logic. I think we can probably stop here unless there is something more, but there's always tomorrow, and we can start from there.
Yes, we just had one request for the book that you recommended, for the title.
What was that?
For the book that you just referenced.
Paper. Oh yes. Let me write it here. It's not a book. It's an essay. And it's Cassirer From Substance to Function. It's normally it's published as a two-part essay, so one on Einstein relativity and the other one on From Substance to Function as a single book. At least that in English. I don't know in other languages. So you probably have to read, well, you probably have to get library, online, buy, etc., the whole collection of the two essays. But the one I'm recommending here is From Substance to Function. Which is exactly what we've been doing in these hours together today, moving from a substance-oriented perspective about the world to a function or relation or process perspective. I better let you go. It's been a long day for everybody, so thank you so much, especially to the directors in the room, Amy and Claudio, who are consulting. So let me just wait until there's something extra.
It's everything fine, Luciano.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. And also for anyone even connecting from Peru. Many thanks. I'll see you tomorrow at 9:30 Italian time.
9:30 British time, 10:30 Italian time.
Sorry. Thank you. I'm